Tonight we're going to talk about Genesis 6, 7, and 8, but we're going to stay really mainly in Genesis 6. And we're going to get into, and I'm really excited about tonight because we're going to get into some parts of Scripture and some holes in Scripture and their probable answers that are some really amazing things that most people, 99.8% of the people, and who come to church regularly have never even heard of before, which is a bit scandalous, frankly. Sometimes I'd be curious to see what Luke says about this since he's fresh off his MDiv. Is that I always thought that the majority of the stuff, and it's been a long time since I've been in doing Old Testament or New Testament surveys, but a lot of the biblical scholarship isn't necessarily doesn't really necessarily aid the growth of your faith so much. Is that, Luke? Would you agree with that, or give me a counterpoint to that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think unless you're at a very unique seminary, that would be considered harmful to your academic studies to tie it into a spiritual growth.
Yeah.
So I think there's this tendency that probably doesn't exist within like studies of other religions, but it's somehow come up in Christian studies that you kind of have to separate the two.
So reason why I bring that up is because oftentimes if you go to seminary and learn about historical criticism and literary criticism and source criticism and all of that sort of stuff, it doesn't really necessarily get to the heart of what it means to be a Christian. It doesn't aid your growth as a Christian so much. It aids your ability to be an academic and to do research and to write books and teach. But you're not. Sometimes I think people get the expectation that you go off to seminary and then you learn all about the Bible that you need to know to grow as a Christian and share it. Not really the case. Tonight, though, this is where biblical scholarship actually aids our growth as a Christian and our development as we get into Genesis 6. Because as we'll, and I won't delay too long, there is a gaping hole in the story that has been that the text just steps right over, and biblical scholarship in this case actually points us to what should fill that hole, and it's really, really exciting and really, really interesting. And we'll get to it in a second. But we're in Genesis chapter 6. And just to give you the larger context, if you haven't really read it recently, is Genesis 1 and 2 is the creation of all things, including human beings. Genesis 3 is the fall, the transgression of Adam and Eve and the consequences that followed. And then in Genesis 4, it's Cain and Abel and the birth of Seth, which is the third child of Adam and Eve. And then chapter 5 is a list of the generations between Adam down to Noah. How many generations? Any guesses off the top of your head? Christine, take a guess, just for me. Just play the game. How many generations between Adam and Noah do you think?
This is good. This is going to be embarrassing, but I'm going to say 35.
See, my connection is breaking up. I think you said 10, and you're right. There are 10 generations between Adam and Noah, and I knew you'd have the answer. It's exactly the case. And so we have them. And sometimes I think that the numbers of generations has a meaning in and of itself. What does 10 mean? I don't know. But whenever you see numbers in the Bible, there's a very, very good chance that number stands for something and is very symbolic, especially when you look at the ages of the individuals, which is interesting in chapter 5, is that we have how old everyone was. Adam in chapter 5, verse 5, he lived 930 years and he died. Seth, 912, he died. Enosh, 905, died. Now we're kind of going down the list here a little bit. We're kind of decreasing, but then we'll go back up, and then we get down to Jared and Enoch. Jared was the father of Enoch, and Enoch lived 365 years. This is very important. This seems like a very, very throwaway line in chapter chapter 5, verse 21 through 24. Verse 23 says, "Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." Now, there are a couple things that I think are worth paying attention to. One is that he lived 365 years. Now, what immediately pops in your mind when you hear 365 years?
A year.
The year. Good job, Joanna. Absolutely right. So that may be one way of saying it was a full life. It was a complete life, the entire year. And you know something about Enoch already, because I know all of you are bright people and have probably heard me mention this before. The one difference in the portion about Enoch from all the other generations is that Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. The words "and he died" are not mentioned. So in the Old Testament, there were two people who lived and did not die, Enoch being one and Elijah being the other, which is why, now that alone explains an awful lot, because this is why that some of the people in the New Testament thought that John the Baptist might be Elijah, right? Because he didn't die. And if he didn't die, he can return. Same reason why in modern Seder feasts, there's a point in the service, for our Jewish friends, they'll sort of symbolically look toward the door and see if Elijah is about to walk in. It's that expectation of return. Elijah has gone. He has seen things. He knows things, and he went up in dramatic fashion in a fiery chariot. So we're going to come back to Enoch. So remember him. All we have about Enoch in the book of Genesis are those three verses, 21, 22, 24 verses, 21, 22, 23, and 24. That's it. He's actually mentioned in the New Testament in the book of Jude. But we'll get to that again a little bit later. Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah. So remember that. So let's talk about what we remember. That's the background, and then we're going to get into it. The thing about the story of the flood is that most people, and I was, Dwayne was mentioning these bookshelves back here, and I was able to pull a lot of the books in my bedroom down here. And I have this book from 1973 or 74. Great Bible Stories for Children. This is something that I used to look at a lot, and I have another one in my office that I don't remember as having the same kind of pictures, but they're there. But this is one of those great things, this was my first image of Adam and Eve was this, right? Eve was beautiful. I had a crush on Eve. She loved little blue birds. I mean, what a wonderful thing. When you get to the story of Noah and the flood, everyone always thinks immediately of an ark, a boat, and giraffes. Giraffes are always in the picture, and I don't know why. Right? Even this book, I was going to mention giraffes before I even pulled up this book, and lo and behold, there are two giraffes. Right? Not every. That's not fair. The most common nursery decoration of Christian parents, or maybe even non-Christian parents, of course, is Noah's Ark. Right? Which is kind of odd when you think about it, because the story of Noah's Ark is that God decided to destroy the face of the earth by drowning all of creation. Hey, Joanna, it's a great story. By drowning all of creation. And then we celebrate that by, just painting it on the walls of our children. What nightmares, right? But we like the story because it has all these wonderful, animals. It's water, it's a boat, but it's really, really, really kind of a spooky thing. And PG-13 alert, for those who need to hear it, it's going to get spookier tonight about some of the stories that we're going to tell. So if you have your Bible with you, look at chapter 6. Chapter 6 begins, When men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide with man forever, for he is flesh, but his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the ground, man and beast and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of God. Now, from there, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then from verse 11, down to verse 22, we have the instruction to build the ark, and we have some of the instructions for it. And the instructions of building the ark take up more space than the stuff that we just completely gloss over. Oh, by the way, angels came down, took wives, had children with those wives, and those children were the Nephilim, that were these demigod giants that were roaming around, the mighty men of old, and wickedness covered the earth. And we just skip right past it. It's like watching a movie with in mixed company or a child, and we just kind of fast forward through the salacious parts and we get toward the end, right? And here are the generations of Noah, and it's going to rain, build an ark, and we get the giraffes and put them on the boat. Pause. What? And so that is not. I looked before y'all logged on. There's someone building an ark. I mean, now there's Cain and Abel. There's nothing in here that looks anything remotely like. Let's see if I can pull up an image here that I found a few minutes ago. There's nothing that looks like this. So what's going on? Now, let's stop there. Have any of you, apart from maybe hearing me talk about this in Bible studies in the past, read Genesis 6 and scratched your head and said to yourself, I've never in my life heard a sermon on Nephilim. I've never in my life have ever even thought about this story and what may be behind it. Has that ever crossed your mind? Or how many of you are hearing this portion of Genesis 6 for the very first time tonight? Chloe, are you serious? Who else raised their hand? Becky, are you serious? How many times have I talked about this? Dwayne and Amy, tell me, right? I've talked about this before, right? Yep.
I've heard you talk about it, but not in Genesis 6. You asked me, did I remember hearing it in Genesis 6? You have talked about Nephilim before. But.
Okay. All right. Okay. Anybody else? Dwayne and Amy remembers this being discussed there, right? So, okay, good. All right. Now, so clearly there's a hole in here. And so this is where in biblical studies, where they look at sort of textual criticism, and they look at the text as a whole, and it almost looks like, it looks very much like, when I taught one semester at Greensboro College, Old Testament, and these students had zero desire to study Old Testament, and they discovered this website called SparkNotes. And these were people who could not, hold a sentence together in class when I asked them a question, but they wrote the most beautiful things in their papers. Well, this is really, really intelligent. So much so that I would Google their sentence and discover it all on SparkNotes. And so they would have a sentence or two that didn't make any sense, this beautiful, eloquent, erudite paragraph, and then nonsense for a few more sentences, and then this other great paragraph. Textual criticism would say, just looking at this from a forensic standpoint, something's afoot here that's just not right. And then you start Googling it to see, oh, that's where it came from, and then you fail them for plagiarism. So textual criticism would look at this and say, okay, gosh, we're going down the generations of Adam. We hit Enoch. We notice that he didn't die. And we go down to Noah, And then we have this little bit we have 8 verses of the Nephilim. And then it really does make a hard shift, and sort of the language changes, the wording changes a bit, and it just looks like there's some copy and pasting, or maybe there's been some things that have been taken out. Enough remains in Genesis 6, 1 through 8, that sets the reason as to why the flood came, that there was wickedness and a little bit of a hint of the Nephilim, but that's about it. Okay, do you see that when you read it? And so that's what biblical scholars who do these types of works, that's kind of what they're looking at, right? And they're also looking at it in the Hebrew text, where some of these differences can really come off the page, and you can, or off the papyrus, or whatever they're reading. Now, let's talk again about Enoch. From what you remember in previous studies, when do most scholars believe that the majority of the Old Testament was written? During what period in the history of the Hebrew people did we have a lot of the biblical story being written? By the way, everyone, this is Harry in the bottom corner. He's in my bottom corner. He's new to us from Cleveland, so glad you're with us. So what did I say?
Is it exile?
Exile, thank you. That was the question. When was it written? During the exile, right? So remember, we've talked about in previous Bible studies, especially Ezra, Nehemiah, and the best example that I keep using is the one about passing down the recipe, is that you never really write down a recipe until someone asks for it, or grandma doesn't have long to live and she made the best biscuits and she only knew how to make them, so you better ask her how she did it before it's lost forever, that kind of thing. So when you're reconstituting a community, like when you're in exile and then you're going back to rebuild the temple and rebuild the nation, you need to write down these stories and the history, so that generations who have been absent from the land and from the structure and the culture can learn it. And that's typically when lots of that happen. And you can see psychologically why you would do that, right? Is that if you've been scattered all across the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, you had this need to want to preserve who you are and your history and your culture and the things that the struggles that your people had, so they wrote them down. And there were different groups of people who would write them down depending on what was really important to them. This is where we get now we're getting into some more source criticism. So if textual criticism is looking at how the text looks and noticing holes and gaps, source criticism is trying to ask, where does this come from? Just as the name implies, source criticism. This is where you get in the Old Testament, looking at those who are like the priestly writers, sort of those who favor what we call what the scholars call like the Deuteronomists and the Yahwehists and the Elohists. These are just people, these scholars recognize there are like 4 different strands in the Old Testament, especially in the first 5 books, that represent different groups of writings that may have happened during the exile, and they were compiled together by an editor. There is tension between, let me get down to the point. There is tension between the priestly writers who wrote a lot in Leviticus and the writers who compiled perhaps the book of Deuteronomy. One favored what the temple life was like with the first temple, and one was focused more on the second temple. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. I don't mean to bore you, but just remember from early in the pandemic, we studied Ezra and Nehemiah. I think a lot of you, most of you were on that call. Is the temple was destroyed in the 6th century and then was rebuilt. And that's when they had to kind of start over. And remember, there were people who saw the second temple being built who remembered the first temple, and they cried. It's a very, very strange line in Ezra about the people cried. Some scholars think it's because something had changed in the second temple that was different from the first. How it was made, the theology, the worship, but something had changed. One of the things that biblical scholars think that was contained in the first temple spirituality were the writings of Enoch, or the books of Enoch, that were very much from a priestly perspective. Here's something interesting. When you the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, that were found in the 1940s in the caves in Qumran, which again we've talked about, and you remember what those are about. But just to recap, what makes the Dead Sea Scrolls significant as an archaeological find is these were these preserved scrolls in clay jars that had been really untouched for 2,000 years. And then when you open them up and you see the biblical texts that we have today, primarily the scroll of Isaiah, is with minor exceptions, the same Isaiah you have in the Bibles that's in your living rooms right now. That's a really powerful affirmation of confidence in the biblical text, if it is the same after being literally sealed up for 2,000 years. It also gave us an insight into early first century Judaism. And to a certain segment of Judaism. Here's what's interesting. In those clay jars, I think Isaiah may have been the most popular scroll in all of them. Guess what the second most popular scroll, or fragments of the scroll, guess what the second most popular was? You can probably guess based on what we're talking about tonight. You're right. Joanna is right. Enoch. Enoch was the second most popular scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What's that tell us? They thought it was significant. So what is it? From what I remember, there are some copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Ethiopian, the Coptics, not Coptics. Would you call Ethiopian Christians Coptic, Christine? Okay, Egyptian and Ethiopian. Yeah, okay.
They're the Oriental church.
Oriental. Thank you. It's in Ethiopian is I think is where you see most of this stuff, and I think Enoch is considered canonical scripture in the Ethiopian church, but you can find it online. So let me just show you. Let me share my screen. Before I do that, let me pause. Can I clarify anything before we go deep into First Enoch? Are you tracking with me so far? Okay. All right. Let me share. So here we are. And if you're really interested in it, I can email you this website where you can look at it on your own. This is from First Enoch, written probably in 300 BC, which is toward the end, after the exile, around the Greek occupation. If you go down to chapter 6, so we're in chapter 6 in Genesis, and we're in chapter 6 in First Enoch. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied in those days, were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared. Remember Jared, the father of Noah? This is where you get the phrase, they went to Jared. It's a joke. You know, he went to Jared, jewelry store. Shall I move on? Move on. To the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And these are the names of their leaders. I'm not going to read them, but there they are. And then all the others with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go into them and defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. This is not in my great Bible study book that I had growing up at all. And Azazel. You ever heard that word Azazel before? Azazel sometimes is used, if I am not mistaken, Azazel was the name of the demon in William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, I think. I'm gonna have to go. I've got the book here somewhere behind me, and I may look for it and see if it's there. I think that was the name of the demon that started it all in The Exorcist. So Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them in bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, whatever that is, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones and coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication and were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways, so on and so forth. And then we go down to chapter 9. I'm not going to keep reading it. We have Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. There are the archangels in there, and they see this. And now we talk about the holy ones. And now to you, the holy ones of heaven. And there was one other place I want to show you. Where was it? Here we are. We're going to come back to this. And all shall be smitten with fear, and the watchers shall quake, capital W, and great fear and trembling shall seize them unto the ends of the earth. So typically the watchers are the ones who were the angels who came down to make wives of the daughters of men. Now, tell me what you notice from all those chapters in First Enoch.
Sounds a lot like the verses in Genesis,
Yeah.
but not as censored as the lines in Genesis.
Correct. Does it seem to you like it's filling in a lot of the holes? Like clearly, does it read? I don't want to lead the witness and project onto you. Does it seem like? Thank you, Christine. I just saw your chat. Azazel though was in the Denzel Washington movie Fallen. I know that for a fact, which wasn't nearly as good as The Exorcist. It doesn't seem to me when I read First Enoch that it is just a commentary on Genesis, but that maybe this was taken out of Genesis because Genesis does have so many gaping holes in there, and Enoch was a long-standing traditional text. What else do you know?
I was kind of wondering, because when you read Genesis, to me, there's no clear indication that the sons of God that came down were angels, because it just says sons of God. So, but Enoch clearly says they're angels. So is that why we think they were angels, because of Enoch? Is what's in Enoch?
Well, the sons of God were angels, yeah, and I think there's elsewhere and I can't give you chapter and verse. There's elsewhere where the angelic beings would be called the sons of God.
Sorry if this is kind of a silly question, but were they fallen angels?
They were then. Yeah.
Because I mean, it's not like they had any good influence at all.
No, I know.
On human beings.
Amy, let's see. It was in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4. You don't have to turn to it. I'll just read it. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them into pits of nether gloom to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, and goes on talking about Noah. I mean, you can make the argument, I think, that the angels in that condemnation were not necessarily the ones involved in Noah, in this story, but they're also put together that you could make the argument that Second Peter is making the connection that the angels had sinned and fallen, and this is the context that they're in. And then elsewhere where you have references to the sons of God being different from the sons of man. Luke?
Quickly. Job 1:6 also uses the same thing. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among with them."
Yep, thank you. Yep.
I think that's another clear reference that it seems to be the fallen angels.
Anything else before I point you to something I think is fascinating? What did Azazel, what did Azazel teach human beings to do? Two things in particular.
Metal, right?
Not just metal, but to do
Yeah.
what? Yeah, you're right. What they do.
Great weapons with metal.
Absolutely. And what else?
Sorcery?
Makeup?
Sort of makeup. Yeah. Yeah. The demonic influence was war and seduction. Right? Makeup. So basically they gave Azazel taught them how to make weapons out of metal and out of pigments. It's interesting to really kind of boil that down to the wickedness that involved into painting ourselves up and then adorning ourselves with makeup. To what end is the question, and to wear breastplates. To what end? It's really, really interesting and an interesting meditation. And I'm not saying if you have a weapon or wear makeup, you are a quasi Nephilim. What I'm saying is, it's interesting if you were to look at sort of the motivations of sin, how those two elements come into play. I think it's a very, very interesting commentary of that. And from that innovation, that invention, came all the wickedness. Obviously all the wickedness came from the fall of Adam, but you get the point. It's an interesting meditation, I think, on that. Athelstan Riley died in 1945. He was a very wealthy, very interesting Anglo-Catholic in England. And he has written, he wrote one hymn and translated one hymn in our hymnal. One of the hymns that he wrote, or the hymn that he wrote in our hymnal, is one that you know. And it begins with, "Ye watchers and ye holy ones, bright seraphs, cherubim, and thrones, raise the glad strain, Alleluia, Alleluia." What's he talking about? Ye watchers, first Enoch, and ye holy ones, first Enoch. Even more so is that to really kind of make things really interesting about Enoch, it's just so you don't think that this is just some sort of silly little biblical wild goose chase. I don't know how old I was, but it wasn't too long ago that I finally realized this was actually in the New Testament. Jude, verse 14. Jude's only one chapter, so when you see like Jude 14, it's not Jude chapter 14, it's just the 14th verse. I'll read it to you. It says, "It was one of these also that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with his holy myriads to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of their deeds of ungodliness, which they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which the ungodly sinners have spoken against him." So what in the world is Jude, a canonical New Testament book? What is he quoting? Gosh, we go all the way up here, and here it is. Remember I said, "Behold, the Lord came with his holy myriads to execute judgment, and behold, he cometh with tens, thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and destroy all the ungodly," etc., etc., etc. So it is Enoch 1:9 that Jude quotes in the New Testament. So it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as popular as Isaiah. Jude quotes Enoch, but it's been completely removed from Genesis. I just find that interesting. Enoch and Genesis 6 raise more questions than the answers they give. And I'm not going to pretend to try to answer any of them, other than to say this is an explanation, the backstory as to why wickedness spread so far upon earth that God needed to start over.
Were the angels? It's weird because it almost makes it sound like you've got this super race of man and angels.
Doesn't almost, it does say that.
Yeah. Running around, that puts a different context on it.
Yep. Anything else before we go a little bit deeper? How many of you have heard this for the very first time? Okay, couple. I think it's fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and you'll never hear "Ye Watchers and Ye Holy Ones" again and not smile, which is a great thing. I think we could spend some time meditating, though, on what does it mean why is it unnatural for the divine and human to come together? I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about that and what that means in terms of allegory, in terms of symbol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, just for tonight, I want to give you some backstory because I knew that would probably be new. That is what is behind the scenes in Genesis 6, 1 through 8. So then we have the starting over to build the ark and the flood to come. I think that, as I said in the beginning, it's very, if you look at the story of Noah by itself, it's a complicated, problematic story. The world was wicked. God was sorry that he had made the world. Now, that's a very interesting theological statement as well. How can God be sorry? That means God made a mistake, which we know is just not in God's nature. So that's almost, I think, when you see that, it's not as if the biblical writers didn't know that God was perfect. It's almost, I think, a way to kind of give a literary cue to, all right, I'm speaking in hyperbole here. I'm actually, of course God is perfect. So what am I trying to say when I say that God was sorry for what he had done? Is I think you look at this and you see that this is a small kernel of how salvation is to come to pass. There is wickedness upon the earth, and God desires for things to be made whole, and God desires for people to be saved. How is that going to happen? In the Old Testament, we see foreshadowing after foreshadowing of how the ultimate salvation comes. Or to look at it this way, and this is something that Christine and Amy would be interested in because of other off Bible study email conversations we're having. If we start with Jesus Christ first and then look backwards, the flood makes a lot more sense from the perspective of the cross. If we start with Jesus Christ and then work backwards, now we see, of course, baptism, right? Which we use that language in our baptismal liturgy. St. Peter in 2 Peter uses the language, uses the flood as an image of baptism, where all the world was saved by water. And how are we saved? By water. And again, see how the image of the flood continues to echo forward is that Noah was delivered through the flood and started over. And then we have deliverance from the Red Sea, crossing through the waters into the wilderness. And then once they're ready to cross into the promised land, they cross the Jordan River. John the Baptist was baptizing in the Jordan River. Jesus changes John's baptism into his baptism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that goes even further back into our anthropology, is that we come into this world by the breaking of the waters of our mother. It's just powerfully consistent again, and again. So if you were to look at it by itself, it's a very petulant, petty, scary story that's completely and wholly inappropriate to adorn the walls of children as an image of a loving God. But to look at it from the perspective of the Christian faith in Jesus Christ first, it makes an awful lot of sense, right? And even the story of the Nephilim makes a little bit more sense, where we try to control the world and control our own destiny by force or seduction. And if we give in to that, we're listening not to the words of the holy ones, but the watchers, right? And the idea of all, and then, you know, people would like to look at all the animals on the ark and say, you know, it is absolutely impossible that you can put every animal on the ark, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, don't you think the biblical writers knew that? I mean, we have this this modern arrogance that no one was smart until we were born. I mean, if you do any ancient history study, I know you all have, there were some brilliant, brilliant people who could do complex mathematics, complex astronomy, complex everything long before we ever thought about coming on this earth. Of course, they knew that. That's not the point they were trying to make. The point they were trying to make is God wanted to save everything and has a desire to save everything and to have everything be made new. And to say that all the animals were put on the boat is a way to say that through the waters of baptism, all creation is made new. What a powerful way to say it. A beautiful way to say it. And then to have the rainbow as the sign of that. Oh my gosh, that's the light of Jesus Christ passing through the waters of baptism, which makes you into a new creation. And it's there. And every time you see a rainbow, you're to remember what happened in this story. Why do you make the sign of the cross? Why do you touch holy water? For the same reason. It's your theological rainbow that you use. So you remember your baptism and what baptism does and all those powerful things. So that, I think, is a more appropriate way to look at the story. Now, let's talk just a little bit. And Luke and I have not talked about this before we've done it, but you know, when you've got a recent seminary graduate, I'm going to use those resources when I can, because I am 15 years removed. Is every freshman college student does, or even in high school, will read the Epic of Gilgamesh and have some smart teacher completely rock the faith of some young tender Christian when they discover that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, this Mesopotamian, Sumerian story, wherever it came from, has essentially the exact same story in there with some details changed around. I know Luke has done some work with this with our youth and talking to them about that and helping them understand it. I think there maybe are a couple of ways to look at it. Actually, Luke, tell me what you would tell the youth about the Epic of Gilgamesh.
So I think the 2 points that I made, or 2 ways to interpret it, are one is that it should strengthen your belief that many religions around that time were dealing with a flood. I mean, could have been an actual, you know, worldwide event at the time, and they were all interpreting it through their own theological lens. And so that was one reason I gave. And then the other one is that the differences between the stories matter more than the similarities. And so with the youth, we really stress the interpretive goals of the book of Noah and Genesis in the context that it occurs in are so drastically different than the Epic of Gilgamesh. And just because there's similar names and events that take place should drive us to the differences instead. And so some of the differences that I pointed out are putting one singular God in charge of it. This is not a fight among gods, and the water god, decides to do something. It's something more singular going forward. And so there's a monotheism in Noah. And then I also just stress the point that there's a lot of stories like this, and there's a lot of shared stories among these early religions. And it wasn't that they were one of them was, the earliest one was the true one, and all the others are just copying from them, which is, I think, how it normally gets presented. But it's more that all of these religions were talking about similar things, and we're in the same area. And so it's how the Christians, the Jews at the time, the Hebrew people, were interpreting these events that I think matters the most. And then especially as we come into it with the lens of Jesus Christ and view it from that, it really matters how the Noah story differs from these other epics. So I was trying to get them to realize that as much as people like to stress the similarities, that shouldn't change much about the story. And what matters is how it differs, and the whole point of the story in Noah is so entirely different than the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Exactly. Think about it this way. In 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, how many books, movies, television shows, or whatever's around then are going to be based on the plague, on COVID-19? And how different will those be? And then how many different movies, books, etc., plays will be based on alternate endings to the plague, right? I mean, you use the plague as the story, and then people will use it however they want to. So absolutely, perhaps there was this great event that impacted, the known world, that area, and they all used it as a part of the meta narrative. And the other thing could be is that maybe this was a story. Maybe let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it was Mesopotamian, origin started there, but it was used to tell the story, the truth of God's love and God's redemption by the Hebrew people. Doesn't change it, but maybe it was used that way. And we'll never really know. There's no way we can determine, for sure on that. But here's what we do know, is that looking at it from the lens of Jesus Christ, we look back and we make sense of it instead of the other way around. So we start with Jesus, and then we go backwards, and then we see baptism, we see salvation, we see all of that in there, instead of starting with Noah and the flood and then trying to find, does this prove Jesus? No, we start with Jesus, then we go back and understand the past. That's how I think we read it. My daughter, who's upstairs eavesdropping, sent me a text and said, "You learn about Gilgamesh freshman year of world history." In high school, I guess. So yeah. Yeah. That's a good place to stop. That's a lot of information. Questions, comments, etc.?
I have a question. I was told by some people that Goliath is connected to the Nephilim. Goliath is one of the results of these kind of giants. Did you come across that in any?
I've heard it. It's been a while since I really dug deep into it. I don't know if Enoch, and there's more than one book of Enoch addresses that. I don't know, but that would be kind of that would make sense, wouldn't it? Because he was the giant among people. I get the feeling, and I'm guessing that I think that the heights given for the Nephilim are far higher than Goliath. So I don't know if the heights were diluted over the generations, how that works. I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to ask that measurement.
Yeah.
Whatever that was.
I don't know what's, such and such L's is, but I think I remember reading a footnote giving an example. I mean, it was being kind of ridiculously high on that. I think we start chasing some rabbit holes, trying to prove the genealogy and the dilution of the heights and how that works. And we do better to sort of look at the bigger picture of what's being relayed here. I mean, there is. Listen, no one thinks the Bible is. I mean, I think the Bible is absolutely central, and we should pay attention and be very serious with every single word of it. And it should challenge us, and it should convict us, and it should cripple us a bit in our ignorance of how we don't fully understand how it is. I think we also need to take the Bible in its own terms. I think it gives us winks and nods by saying, "I'm painting a scene here. Go with me on the scene." I'm using poetry here. Pick up my rhyme and meter, and don't overthink it, but go with me here. Because the things that are the most important are things that we can't, I mean, it's not a mechanical diagram. It's the things of God. And the things of God can only, I mean, types and shadows is the language that we use. It can only be done as a painting or a poetry or a melody, right? And not as instructions. That doesn't mean that we don't take it seriously or don't believe it or don't think it's true. It means actually we do take it seriously and we do believe it's true, and we're receiving it on its own terms. Does that make sense? So, I mean, if you build the house of cards, that you must find a genealogy of the Nephilim, and if you go around and you find, and you go to the NBA, I think the NBA must be sort of the descendants of the Nephilim because they're all 6'8" and taller. It's kind of missing the point, isn't it? That's not the point that's being made. This is not Dan Brown genealogy bloodline stuff trying to prove things on that. That's not what the Bible itself is trying to do. It's respecting our intelligence to be able to understand the tapestry that's being woven through all of these stories. I think the main thing I want you to take away, though, is that there was a tradition of the temple that may have been excised from the text, and we can talk maybe later about what all that might mean. But that I think for me personally, the real fruit in meditation is that we were taught seduction and warfare, and what all that means for the state of humanity, and that Noah and the flood is a powerful image of baptism. And of course, let's end on this: if the waters of baptism, if the waters of the flood were baptism, what's the ark? If you're gonna say it, Jeff, you gotta unmute yourself. I think you had the right word.
The church?
Absolutely, 100%. And you've heard me say this 100 times. I mean, look up at the church and look how it looks like a boat turned upside down. You're sitting in the nave, navis, naval, ship. It's the bark of Christ. It's the boat of Jesus Christ. Think about how many times he taught from the boat, right? And walking on the water and all these sorts of things. I mean, just the imagery starts just to kind of cascade on top of one another and make an awful lot of sense. And so, yes, that's what the boat is. It's carrying us to the promised land through the waters of baptism. 100%. Yeah. Good. Miss Catherine, you okay? Good. All right, guys. Any other questions or comments or anything? If not, we'll close for tonight. I'm sorry, Becky was the one that gave me the exorcist name and not Christine. I'm sorry. I didn't want to not give you credit, Becky. I read the
So not a big deal.
yeah. How do you know the obscure characters of the Exorcist?
Google.
Okay. There
That's
we
what
go.
all cool kids do. Look at Google.
Very good. I hope this was interesting. We'll do some New Testament next month. But for those of you who are new, so I don't know if everyone is arranged in the same order as they are on my screen. But you've met Terry before. Terry is newish to St. Tim's, came in this summer, and of course Harry's in my bottom right. And so Terry and Harry, the McFerrins, me, Becky, Jeff, Klingstead, Stefan, the Pigots are coming from South Carolina. And then Miss Catherine Hodges, she's at the bottom of my screen. So that's everybody. And it's good to see all of you. And we'll check you next time. Bye.
Bye. Good night.